At the time of release, the remake for Resident Evil 3 was mostly regarded as a failure, especially coming off the heels of the triumphant remake right before it with Resident Evil 2. Now, whatever your opinion on the remake may be, let's dive deep into how close this remake actually is to the original. I'd wager we'll find some things you may have not noticed. I will say there's definitely things the remake recycled and still managed to cram into the game, but a lot of that may just be behind the scenes and in the background versus a playable aspect like in the original game. Let's give it a go, starting with the original as our frame of reference. As we can see from the start, the openings are pretty different. Originally, we get a monologue from Jill describing the beginning of this game's events. She is in fact in her apartment, but we don't play starting in it, but just outside of it, unlike what we see in the remake of beginning in there and Nemesis breaking through a wall, chasing Jill out of it. To be quite frank, the differences from here on out get pretty drastic at times. Sometimes, including a section or set piece, but using it in a very different way altogether. We're going to weave a bit in and out of this game, start to finish, comparing and contrasting the two. Did the remake include this or not? And how did they? Before I dive further, detail for detail, let's just overview the maps and locations so we have a handy dandy frame of reference for overarching layout at the most basic level and how that broke the foundation for the remake from the start. The original begins in the city. Good so far, but it's not just the city, it's a city divided into parts. A huge omission from the remake. Even though it's assumed we are always in Raccoon City throughout the entire game, we don't understand that we are in downtown Raccoon City or in uptown. The remake makes it feel much smaller in that regard. Matters are a bit worse knowing the game itself is also much shorter. But we have the city divided into sections, roads and back alleys connecting most of it. Another issue for the remake as it doesn't do that at all. The original allows you at almost any given point until you reach certain events in the story to go back and forth throughout the city, downtown and uptown, the RPD, City Hall, and connecting the hospital with the park and the clock tower and the sewers, then leading eventually to the factory. For reference, the remake is basically just the city to the sewers to RPD, hospital, and the factory beneath the hospital. It's a shorter game because they did half of the work. It's such a shame because they shortchanged this game so hard. And it clearly wasn't a priority, but just a check mark on Capcom's list of things to get through. Sadder even more is that Resident Evil Code Veronica wasn't even a box option, but a skip to get to the Resident Evil 4 remake. Now that we have the foundation for overall game locations and how those compare and fell wickedly short, let's continue through the events of the original and see if the remake included it in any capacity. After a short stroll through back alleys, we end up in the warehouse with the guy who decides to hide in the semi-truck's trailer. We came in from roughly the same direction, but we notice we are limited to going in on the first level and exit at the back door. Originally, we are able to navigate the alleyways outside the entry door after exiting, and on top of going on the first floor, we are able to go on the second floor for a key, traditional safe and save typewriter, and a few supplies to get you started. The guy roughly says the same, "Leave me alone, I'm staying here," bit of dialogue, but a bit elongated in conversation compared to the original. After this, right back into the streets and navigating the city. A significant change is that we see a glimpse of STARS member Brad dealing with zombies and running away. We haven't seen Nemesis yet, which we do almost instantly in the remake, and we mostly are trying to catch up to him and deal with zombies. The city already feels pretty large for the level design, as we've gone through numerous streets and alleys in a short time. If this were the remake, we'd have already gone through all of the first area if we're doing a street-for-street comparison. In both versions, Brad converses with Jill in a bar, the difference being the original isn't just a cutscene, it's also explorable, whereas it's only just the cutscene and unexplorable in the remake. The way in which Brad dies is also different between the two games.
Jill!
Brad!
We've gotta... Jill! Help!
You stay on the door. I got this fucker.
The remake throws a pretty big curveball here and subverts to seeing the Tram system really early, meeting Carlos already and another Nemesis encounter. Keep in mind, we've yet to see Nemesis yet thus far, and the Tram system, which we'll have to repair ourselves and find 3 items in order to do so, is a ways away still. We don't even have to fix the tram, or in this instance, the subway train, as it's changed to in this game. Just get the tracks aligned for our next destination. Completely different approach to each, one having multiple steps, the other a singular task. Early on in both games, we come across a fire that blocks our path. We'll need to collect a fire hose to put it out. Same for both games, but one is done in about a few minutes, while the other will take much longer before we even come back to it. Also, not that we're paying attention to enemy types and locations, because that mostly gets way deeper than you or I probably care about, but zombie dogs attack here. We'll see those in just a minute in the remake. We have some enormous changes between the two, and this next part is the first major change. The RPD police department from Resident Evil 2 stands before us in this game as Jill. Much more impactful to story and lore, as we already have a huge connection and nostalgia for this location. Not only that, but to have Jill, an original member, go to this location is fantastic on so many levels. Obviously, we know she worked here in the building. We know Chris and the cast of the original all were here. We get to explore the offices and desks of each. It just means more. The remake butchers this entirely. To have Carlos explore it is meaningless. It's banking entirely just solely on nostalgia only, which isn't good enough. Even worse, Jill doesn't even show up here in any capacity in the remake, and due to the story of the remake, there's no possibility that can even happen. I'd say it seemed like most gamers were upset about the clock tower, but this is actually the biggest travesty of the remake in and of itself. If we ignore the simple fact Jill isn't at the RPD, what gameplay elements are comparable for the RPD in general? Well, Brad is in front of the building for both games, but he's just a super zombie in the remake, and in the original we get Nemesis killing Brad and having an encounter with Jill. This also brings in the huge addition of choice in the original game as well. We don't see this at all in the remake, but originally event scenarios pop up which can alter the outcome of the ending of the game. Yes, there's another big change. Resident Evil 3 does have different endgame cutscenes, some of which depend on these in-game options. But also these can unlock different weapon upgrades, infinite ammo, and more if you choose to fight Nemesis in these optional encounters. Technically, you do get drops from fighting Nemesis in the remake, but that doesn't alter or change the ending, and you don't get as good of drops as the original game. Resident Evil 3 has multiple different endgame cutscenes, whereas the remake has one. Pretty lame, as even Resident Evil 2 Remake had different cutscenes for an A and B scenario, and each character, Leon or Claire, which this game also does not have choosable characters, even though you actually do play as Carlos or Jill throughout the game, but you don't get the choice, it's just a singular experience. The original RPD in Resident Evil 3 is a very simple and outdated layout, making complete sense that a modern update would revise it and make it more practical and better suited for modern gaming. So that being the case, I've actually got no real issue with that substantial change in the remake for both 2 and 3. It's not insanely different. The rooms pretty much all exist in the update. Heck, the remake for 2 even expanded on the character Marvin for 2 and slightly for 3 as well. Slight positive there. But then we go back to the fact that there's no Nemesis to chase us in the RPD like in the original game. Now Nemesis only cares about stars and stars members, so Carlos is off the menu. That explains why they didn't include him. But it also leads back to the problem of should have used Jill here. Could have also been more intense than Mr. X's walk around to chase you in Resident Evil 2 Remake. If Nemesis is running at you and shooting rockets at you in the RPD, talk about intense. Instead, just nothing. Just a couple of generic lickers to deal with. Mostly just a hello goodbye for the RPD in the remake. Also, it bugged me personally that the original used the radio, and both remakes didn't even use it once. Yet there it is, sitting there for no real reason, but nostalgia. For this next section, we are at a crossroad in split directions each game takes. The original is going to backtrack and then explore the next half of the city. The remake, well, we gone. Deep into the sewers after a mini cutscene / Nemesis chase sequence. Just so you know, if you're still listening, the original doesn't even deal with a large sewer section. It's almost entirely exclusive to the remake itself. I'm going to suggest that if I had to take a wild guess and presume what Capcom did here, it's that they cut corners, maybe due to time constraints, budget, whatever it may be, and reuse assets of the sewers from the Resident Evil 2 remake to add in a section for the Resident Evil 3 remake. Doing so saves time and money, but it replaces locations they cut, like the other half of the town, the park, the clock tower, etc. Now again, that's just a guess on my part, but it would explain some of why the remake didn't turn out as well as it could have and probably should have. Now with the backtracking in full commencement, we go through a parking garage, which if I'm being a smartass to myself, is technically present in the remake. Yeah, I'm being that guy right now. It's used very early in the game, right after first seeing Brad. You enter a parking garage, and at the top do a quick time event sequence in a car, ramming Nemesis off the building. All done within about a minute. In fairness, it's about the same length of time for the original, but it does have one of those choice event moments that actually gives you 2 different level designs. If you choose option A, you stay in the garage. If you choose option B, you fall into a small passageway beneath where you just were, temporarily making you traverse different terrain. It's a hiccup in the scheme of things, but these small changes make the game more replayable and interesting. You could argue the remake has zero replayability as it lacks any choice whatsoever, or alternate endings. Surprising that I actually do still really like the remake for some reason, isn't it? Next, Jill makes her way to a restaurant for another Nemesis encounter. But first we meet Carlos. Oh, you met Carlos a long time ago in the remake, yet here's his first appearance. The game presents itself with yet another one of those choice options, giving, once again, more replay value and variation in level design. Notice a theme here. The original is stacking replay value, creativity, and variations in design, each time making the remakes a little bit more and more underwhelming in effort. After this short bit at a restaurant, which does exist in the remake technically, and Nemesis is allowed in this scripting AI to enter into except for the save room of it, it is a bit disappointing that the areas the remake did include all seem bundled in one area and crammed in. Again, comes off like a checklist. Did we include this building? Yes, but not this next one. As we scurry away from Nemesis, we enter the Raccoon Press building. An item we pick up in this location is relegated to being in the Toy, Uncle, or Mega Man shop in the remake. Not a thing in the original, but also completely skippable, and Nemesis cannot enter in one, but shows up in the other one. Now, aligning both games back together a bit is the train, or tram, if you will. Still very different from one another, but at the most basic, simplistic level, have the same agenda. Transport characters out of the city section of the game and proceed to the next area. First things first though, in the original, we build up a bit more douchebaggery for Nikolai as he explodes the gas station. I do think the remake covers this a bit, but in a different way and at a different time. Nikolai kills an injured comrade and did so in the most heartless way and without proof his comrade was turning towards becoming a zombie. Even if in all likelihood he was, it shows his ruthlessness. Same sort of deal here, but probably aiming to take care of any evidence by killing Jill. In the gas station's explosion, covering all of his traces. Back to the train though. The original still needs some more parts to make it work. The remake, we just align the tracks and get back to the train. The remake already dealt with the power plant and bugs. The original is about to do just that. Also giving us a grenade launcher, which we'll get later in the remake side of it. Making our way back, we still have something you probably forgot about by now, the fire hose. That's right. Deep into the game, we still have yet to deal with our blocked off pathway. In the remake, we don't get this next cutscene, but in the original, Carlos has to kill a comrade just turned zombie and deal with the sorrow of the situation. Then as Jill approaches, run away in tears.
Carlos!
Collecting another piece to the tram missing part prerogative, and yes, you finally can leave the city. One game took much longer trying to do so than the other, and yeah, the original isn't quite done yet, but very nearly there. As Jill moseys her way back to the train, a cutscene occurs, shaking and eventually breaking through the ground beneath her. A short sewer worm boss interaction occurs. Basically just run and get out of the pit, the sequence. Once this quick event ends, then we finally
It's looking
depart the
good.
station in sync between the two games. Nemesis appears in both. Mikhail blows up the back cart, but in the original we have an option of trying to slow the train. Doesn't really work, and is basically what occurs in the remake as it crashes. Or to jump out of the window, which, good luck with that. But that does give us two different level layouts to deal with. Before we arrive at the most infamous reason everyone complained about the remake, the clock tower. We made it, exclusively only in the original. Difference being the train crashes in front of it in the original and with Carlos alongside Jill during the train ride. The remake ventures in a very different way, leaving Carlos behind to head to the RPD. And once that section is over, Jill surviving the crash to head to the front of the clock tower for a boss fight with Nemesis. Original bounces between playing Jill and Carlos, just like the remake does for the hospital, but first Jill explores the clock tower before a boss fight with Nemesis.
It's gonna be alright. I'll be ready.
No!
The remake, conversely, skipping to it just for the fight. After the battle is essentially over, Jill gets infected by Nemesis and passes out in both games. Carlos comes to the rescue to find a cure. Onwards to the hospital. I would say, more or less, the hospital is about the same for both games. Different experiences for sure, but the Hunter shows up for the first time here in both games. But once we finish with this building, it's the ending section for the remake that remains. Yet in the original, we have the entire park section of the game to begin with, not even remotely in the remake. The park is a decently sized section of the game, and it also has a boss battle with that irritating sewer worm, Gone Gargantuan.
What's going on? Whoa! Oh. What is that?
That's how they get you. They're under the goddamn ground. Called my ass. He's dead.
Once we solve all of our park puzzles and clear out the tremor worm, we'll have enough Kevin Bacon to make it to the other side of the park at our next destination, the factory for the original's end game sequence. We finally arrived at the end section of the game. One game took the long route, the other the shortcut. But how do these two differ or stay similar at the very end? Well, right off the bat, Nemesis. Roughly kind of the same for both, but not really. Although pushing Nemesis off a bridge is 100% more hilarious than the random explosive tank sequence in the other game. The remake pretty much ignores Carlos in this part until the final boss fight, whereas the original weaves in and out of cutscenes and seeing Carlos at least wander around the building.
They're planning on launching a missile directly into the city as soon as day breaks. Come on, we have to hurry. There isn't much time left.
Hunters also prowl annoyingly throughout a lot of the factory and are really just relegated to just one hallway in the other game. Sounds like easy mode over there in the remake. But the true enemy, as we all know, is Nikolai. That sabotaging, backstabbing, greedy motherfucker. The original does us the great pleasure of gifting him a gruesome death.
Nikolai?
Over in the newer iteration, Capcom lets him die via nuclear explosion. Too kind, after how much of a weasel and dick he was all throughout the game to you. Now, with the nuclear device on its way towards us, and a countdown to doom commencing... Oh wait. Nope, hold it. Just the one game gives us more stress with the countdown. Granted, I will say, timers in video games are almost always bad ideas and make games less fun 99% of the time. I would say this one time, it fits the narrative and it actually feels like a nuclear device was coming at you with literally minutes left while you have to get the hell out before end game. So this actually does kind of fit well with the game, even though those are bad. The Nemesis fight right before imminent doom occurs plays out pretty much the same way. Charge up the sci-fi laser beam to puncture Nemesis a few times and then escape right before Raccoon City bites the dust. However, as I've mentioned before, the remake gives us one end, the original multiple.
Come on! Next time, take the fucking hit! There it is.
There you have it. Made it through to the end of both games. Where Resident Evil 2 and its remake felt like two sides of the same coin, this felt more like a coin and a round rock. Not really the same games, and I didn't even get into the nitty-gritty of dialogue and detailed story elements. As you saw, both games sweep in and out of being similar and different. It really feels like there's so much cut content that we're missing about half of a game. That aligns pretty well with the criticism of it being so short. In some defense of the remake, though, the clock tower section of the game isn't very big, and they both have a Nemesis fight with Jill getting infected in both games. The bigger tragedy is omitting the park, about half a city at least, in-game choices with multiple endings, and if you tallied how many times I was mentioning Nemesis encounter in the original, it'd stack up a lot higher compared to the remake. And no, we don't count cutscenes as interactive encounters. Mind-boggling after Resident Evil 2 Remake's setup of a foundation for how it should have worked in the sequel. Now all that's left is to hope Capcom either remakes the remake which they won't, gives us a director's cut, which they also won't, as they sweep it under a rug in hopes you forget. Well, let's hope the remake for Resident Evil 4 does much better.
This time, it can be different. It has to.